Alrighty. So week 9, I finished grading earlier, and seems like most of you got this. I realized that in my instruction, I had it a little bit wrong because I had to review my own instruction. Because what I wanted you to do was create your example of a week 9 where you set up your own VE&V in your public. That way other people could see it. So I messed up. But anyway, seems like most of you have got it. Now let me show you a key thing that you want to look for to see if you've got it right. Because the only thing I saw at least 2 of you miss was the idea, and it's a really important one, which is updating the get ignore file to not include all those things that you've set, all that library that you've set up. Generally it's one library, but in a real world app, it's probably more. So here's how you know. Once you push your code to the server, these are really the only 3 files I required, but really it's only this one and this one. I required this one because you should give anybody that's installing your virtual env for your Python code, you should give them instruction. So although it may be optional, you absolutely have to have these because this is where, right, the library that you need to install is located. And the thing about this, and I want you to know this, and maybe you knew it intuitively in reading some of your replies, it seems like you were starting to get this, that the whole part of the reason you're doing this is to isolate your library, your code into one area of your computer so that it doesn't run globally on your system. The other idea is when you push to this, GitHub, or if you're using Bitbucket, which is another one, or some other type of version control site, you don't want to include that library that your code needs. And the reason is it just makes it bulkier. It makes it, you're duplicating code that the user using the required .txt can install that into their local system. Now, the other thing, so first understand that. So if in your review on GitHub, once you've set up your virtual environment, if you look at it and you see a bin or a script, that means you missed that really important step of updating your get ignore to tell it not to include that subdirectory. So, way important about that. Okay. Now, the other thing, and I think you got this, but I want to reiterate it because we're moving quickly to Dev 1. And if you in your code determine you are going to want to use a third-party library, then this setup is required. Okay. Now, what this also says is if you don't use a third party, but you just use core Python libraries functionality, even though you may be importing something, but it's from the core Python versus a third party, because core Python is already built into the Python that you have running locally and that I have running locally. So you don't need to do in virtual environment if you're not using third-party code. Okay. So that will be one, and I don't make you use I don't require you to use third-party code. I will say to you though, using third-party code with any programming language is just a part of the more you advance in that language and your ability to do, to accomplish something, a concept through code, in other words, creating something, you generally find it is really good to use a third party because it's like, why reinvent it when you can leverage somebody else's? Now, there's also downsides, right? The thing about virtual environment, though, you can also freeze the version, which is good and bad. But if the developer of that library changes to a new version of their library, but your code depends on the old version, then you can require that. But what that also means is over time, you're probably going to need to, which you probably will, update your code anyway. And you would probably want to, not probably, you would want to at least evaluate the changes of the library to see if it's something you want to take advantage of. And a lot of times, not a lot of times, in addition to new functionality, the other thing that they change about the code is making it plugging holes that somebody else will often find in their code. Anyway, so just a little, information about that because I want you to understand when it's required. So here's the other thing. The video from last week, week 9 attendance, it was from last semester, and I've already decided, and I think I'm going to disappoint one person here, but here's how it's going to go. It's already been the only question I now have is sequence. So I want you to give me feedback about any of this, of course, but this particular part. So we are going to end. I put this in the written information in week 9. I don't know if you caught it, but once we get to Dev 1 afterwards, right? And by the way, looking at the calendar, and I think I did not say this to you all, the good news is that Dev 1 will be after the spring break. Okay, so that week before will be after spring break. All right, so let's just look at it real quick. So here's the last week of March. As we roll forward, here is spring break, and then our Dev 1 is there. Okay, so know that. After spring break, we have 2 major topics to complete that will be what we focus Dev 2, our last Dev, on. So for Dev 1, the requirements are already there. I believe I've already covered them. I think I covered them already. If not, I will make sure that they're covered in week 10, Learn Together. If not, just give you a list of those so you can be thinking about that. But after Dev 1, we're going to do classes, object-oriented programming concepts, creating classes, instantiating classes, using methods on those classes that we build to handle our code objectives. And then we're going to do graphical using Tkinter. It's hard to say. My only question, and actually I looked at Tkinter, the library video that I'm using on YouTube, and I realized he has an actual section that I will include that you actually learn how to use Tkinter using OOP. I'm not sure I'm going to require that for the Dev 2, but I know we're also talking in the future and you probably can't go there with me. But I guess what I'm thinking of at this point, if you have any feedback, is whether we do Tkinter and then we do OOP, or whether we do OOP and then Tkinter. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think of the benefits one way or the other. I don't know if it's there. Maybe actually doing Tkinter first gives you a chance to kind of, start, you learn it. We end with using OOP and then we do some more OOP might be a good way. Anyway, so I just want you to know that Dev 1 is after spring break. So that week we're back, which is, I think, good in a way. If spring break is that time that you get to choose whether you take a break during spring break or not. Oh, I got to fix that. I can already see that's off, but that's what I see. Anyway, I just want you to know. And then next week, what's cool is we're going to finish regular expressions, right? So I said this, I believe, in the video for a colon for week 9. Learning regular expressions is like learning a whole other language. And I do have one of my line items in Dev 1 is to use regular expressions in some way. And one of the things I became a little more flexible on was, let's say you found a regular expression you wanted to implement. So at the bare minimum, you need to give reference if you use somebody else's, and then also be able to describe what your regular expression is doing, right? How is it doing either validation of your input or some kind of reading of the file validation? So, but now that I'm talking about that, let's actually just go look real quick so we can see Dev 1. So get user input, right? from the user or use args. You learn about that as running it at the command line or use an external file. I didn't see very many people doing this last time. Store the input that you get from user into a file, right? Or so for me, I would process it before I would store it in the file. Read the file and generate, and this is a key term, summary data. Something that summarizes something about the data that you have. Very common thing to do. Use regular expressions for input or other data processing. Handle input. And then here's the other thing: is you're going to want to add some functionality outside of the course, at least one example, right? And then you are going to need to use debugging tools to walk me through your code. And this is what I was saying earlier, which is use a third party. It's fine. Just make sure, right, you set up your, and this is key. Don't use OS specific libraries. I don't think I ran into this for anyone yet for their dev 0, but just keep it in mind. Just make sure that your library doesn't depend on the Windows environment, the Linux environment, or the Mac environment, which most don't, but sometimes they do. So just make sure that. And why is that true? Well, in general, you don't want to use OS specific libraries because you can't determine you can write code to determine it, but probably for this you wouldn't. And in general, you want to be agnostic. You don't want to think about leaning on the operating system because all the functionality you would need would be in Python itself. I said a lot today. Did you get it all? Did you get it all? Anyway, great examples of code last night. Here's the requirements if you want to just take a screenshot. Let me see if I did talk about them in week 10 Learn Together. So as I scroll forward it, and if you haven't heard me say it, the Learn Together videos were done last semester. Let's see if I talked about and had you review I talked about debugging, right? So I did a little more debugging last time. So I'm glad I talked about it this week. And if I remember right, I might have actually had you think about it. Let's see. I don't remember seeing. Maybe I just showed it. This is me. Probably not the best way to use your time thinking about what it was I assigned. Maybe I did. Let's see. No, I didn't. Okay. I'm glad I did now then. All right, creature on. Right. Okay. Anyway, have a great weekend. And if you have any questions about the content that I've covered, that would be a great thing to reply to. So peace